my name is Catherine, and today I want to talk about Dixie's Daughters by Karen Cox, which is a book that talks about the lasting impact that the UDC, which is the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and it pretty much explores how the UDC shaped Southern memory of the Civil War and how it influenced generations long after the fighting had ended. Karen Cox, who was the author, was a historian, and she showed how the organization worked to preserve a specific version of history through education, public monuments, and even community influence. The UDC is typically remembered for their monuments, but I think that their influence went way beyond this. They tried to carefully have a narrative of the South, which was called the Lost Cause, and this pretty much portrayed the Confederacy as heroic. Meanwhile, it downplayed the role of slavery in the war. And a major way that the UDC shaped history was actually through education. The author explained that the UDC pretty much had a hand in writing textbooks and even influenced school curriculum. Cox wrote that the UDC saw themselves as educators, ensuring the children learned a version of the past that honored Confederate soldiers and leaders, Chapter 2. This pretty much just means that the generations of the Southern children learned a version of history that emphasized this Southern pride while ignoring the realities of the slavery that was occurring. For example, in some of the textbooks, the UDC encouraged descriptions of enslaved people as loyal and content, which is historically inaccurate, and to me this shows how organizations can manipulate education to preserve power structures. And when I think about it today, it makes me kind of question how our own school books might reflect certain biases still. And yeah. Another way that the UDC shaped public memory was through monument building. Cox actually wrote that these monuments were more than stone and metal. They were symbols of Southern pride and a tool to shape public memory, Chapter 4. Basically, between the 19th and the early 20th century, the UDC funded hundreds of statues and memorials which honor the Confederate leaders and soldiers. These monuments were typically placed in bigger locations like courthouses and schools and even city squares. Therefore, the narrative of the Confederacy became pretty much a visual and physical part of everyday life. The UDC also took part in public service, which this further strengthened their cultural influence, and they organized charitable events and sponsored scholarships as well as holding ceremonies that commemorate these Confederate soldiers. Cox wrote that through charity and ceremonies, the UDC reinforced the values and memory of the Confederacy within the communities, Chapter 6. And these actions made the organization more than just a memory-keeping society. They became active participants in shaping Southern culture and identity. And I think that understanding the UDC's influence completely helps us see that history is not just a collection of facts, but it also is important how we remember how these facts are remembered and taught. Who controls the narrative matters, because today's debates over Confederate monuments and how the Civil War is taught in schools are connected to the work that the UDC began more than a century ago. And by studying these groups, we can better understand why some histories are emphasized while others are pretty much erased. But reading Dixie's Daughters actually showed me how memory can persist over generations. In the epilogue, Cox pointed out that the UDC's influence didn't end with the early 20th century. Their stories and ceremonies, as well as textbooks, actually shaped the attitudes about the South for decades. And this shows me that cultural memory is not passive, and it's created and maintained. This also made me reflect on my own education. Like how much of what we learn about history comes from a carefully curated narrative, and whose voices are missing from the story. What I learned from Dixie's Daughters is that the way that we remember the past completely shapes the society that we live in today. Like the UDC showed us that organizations can actually influence generations through education, monuments, and culture. And if we examine these influences critically, we can actually question the narratives that we inherit and work toward a more accurate and inclusive understanding of history. Overall, I think that the UDC still matters today, but not because of the values that they promoted, instead because of their actions and how it reminds me how powerful memory can be, and how important it is to tell history honestly. I think that remembering the past critically is the first step in shaping a better future. Thank you.